In police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. Although many a killer has disposed of his victim's body in deep and murky water, drowning is an unusual method of murder. Perhaps the most famous historical murder case concerning drowning is the so-called Brides in the Bath case. That rather Gothic title accurately conveys the horror that was felt at the time at the callous crimes of George Joseph Smith, a small-time crook who turned to murder as a means of making money and used the domestic bathtub as his murder weapon. One December evening in 1914, a doctor was called out to certify the death of a Mrs. Margaret Lloyd, who had died in the bath just hours after taking her wedding vows. Margaret Lloyd, née Lofty, had been the 38-year-old daughter of a clergyman who had earned her living as a lady's companion. News of her marriage surprised her mother and sisters, who had no idea that she was even courting John Lloyd.
She just went off one afternoon and didn't take any clothes or anything. And that evening they received a letter in the last post to say that she was married, and that's all they knew.
On the day of their marriage, Margaret and her new husband travelled from Bath to London and took lodgings in Highgate. Early next morning they paid a visit to a doctor, because John Lloyd was concerned that Margaret had had a funny turn. He then took her to a solicitor, where Margaret made a will in her husband's favour. Their next appointment was at a post office, where Margaret withdrew all her savings. Prudently, the bridegroom had also insured her life for £700. After such a busy day, Lloyd suggested that Margaret should have a nice warm bath. Their landlady was ironing when she heard the sound of splashing coming from the bathroom above. She would later tell the police that it sounded like wet arms against the side of the bath, but at the time she told no one what she had heard. The next sound the landlady heard was the organ being played in the next-door room. The tune that boomed out was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." The organist was John Lloyd. After Margaret's death, there was a hastily arranged inquest. The verdict was accidental death. Margaret was buried without ceremony in a common grave. Because Margaret Lloyd had died in London, the inquest was reported in a national newspaper. The article caught the eye of a fruit grower from Buckinghamshire named Charles Burnham. His own daughter, Alice, had died in identical circumstances the previous year. A short while before her death, she had married a George Smith, someone whom her father had thoroughly disliked. Alice clearly felt differently.
I have a letter sent by Alice to a member of her family saying how happy she was at the time. In this letter she writes, "The best and happiest time of our lives. My darling husband is the very best any girl could wish for, and so devoted."
Mr. Burnham read the article again and again with a growing sense of unease.
Charles Burnham saw a striking resemblance to his own daughter's death, and consequently straight away contacted Scotland Yard.
John Lloyd was arrested in a solicitor's office in West London, where he had gone to discuss Margaret's will. The police had discovered that George Smith and John Lloyd were one and the same man. And the police learned that there were at least 2 women still alive to whom Smith was married, and so initially they charged him with bigamy. But they suspected him of murder.
Smith was 43 when he was arrested. He'd led a delinquent life. As a boy, he'd been in a reformatory. He was in and out of prison for theft. Smith thought that women, as well as being a source of amusement, were also a source of profit.
As time went by, he refined his money-making techniques. Within days of meeting a suitably vulnerable woman, he would propose marriage. On one occasion, After prompting his new bride to withdraw her savings from the post office, he took her to the park for a stroll. Leaving his wife on a bench, he said that he would just go and get a paper, but he never returned. Instead, he went back to their lodgings, gathered up all her possessions, and left, never to be seen again.
Smith's victims were all of a piece. They were all genteel, spinsterish types, mostly desperate to get married, frightened of being left on the shelf, solitary, lovelorn, and crucially, from Smith's point of view, with independent means. Smith kept another wife, a woman called Edith Pegler, on the go all the time, incidentally, to whom he used to return between these bigamous marriages.
Finally, Smith's money-making scheme went a little awry, and the thief became a murderer. Beatrice Mundy, known as Bessie, was the 31-year-old daughter of a bank manager who had died leaving her the large sum of £2,500, which was put into a family trust. After a whirlwind romance, Bessie and Smith were married. But when Smith, this time calling himself Henry Williams, realized that he wouldn't be able to get his hands on Bessie's fortune, he did his usual disappearing act. He left her, taking with him the £135 he had managed to extract from her family.
Poor Bessie Mundy was completely distraught. This time he wrote his wife a remarkably cruel letter, accusing her of infecting him with a dose of venereal disease. Well, 18 months later, we're told, as a complete accident, the two met again on the seafront at Weston-super-Mare. And despite everything that had gone before, Bessie decided to forget all about that and to have old Smith back. The first thing they did was hasten to a lawyer, where they drew up mutual wills, leaving everything to each other. A curiously lopsided arrangement in the sense that Bessie had about £2,500 in the bank, while Smith at this point was absolutely penniless.
They took a house in Herne Bay, Kent, just right for the start of their new life together. But Smith decided it lacked one thing, a bath, and had soon ordered one from the local ironmongers. Then, just a day after the bath was delivered, Smith took Bessie to a local doctor, explaining that she had suffered a fit. 2 days later, the doctor was called to the house and told that Bessie had had another turn. The next morning, however, the doctor was summoned by an urgent note from Smith that read, "Can you come at once? I'm afraid my wife is dead." When the doctor arrived at the house, he found Bessie lying face up in the bath. The doctor saw immediately that she was dead. An inquest was arranged, and the jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Then the grieving widower hastily had his wife buried in a pauper's grave. As the sole beneficiary of her will, he then devoted his time to the process of collecting his inheritance. The following year, Smith married Alice Burnham, and after her death, Margaret Lofty. When police arrested him after Margaret Lofty's death, they strongly suspected that they had a murderer in their midst, but they had to prove it. They called in the Home Office pathologist, Dr. Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury had already made a name for himself with cases such as that of Dr. Crippen. His opinions carried great weight.
Bessie Mundy, Alice Burnham, and Margaret Lofty were exhumed from their graves. Their bodies were found to be very decomposed, and Spilsbury could not find any life-threatening disease which might have caused their death. He did know that central to the case against Smith was the means of death.
When Smith stood trial, it was for the murder of Bessie Mundy alone. It's unclear why this was, but the deaths of Alice Burnham and Margaret Lofty were only used as evidence to illustrate what became known as Smith's system of murder.
Smith's formula was in 3 parts: find a woman, find a bath, and find a doctor.
At the trial, Smith's defence focused on the health of Bessie Mundy before her death. It was their assertion that the fit she had suffered rendered her unconscious, causing her to drown. The doctor who was called by Smith to the house gave evidence as to the position that Bessie Mundy lay in. As he recalled, She lay with her back towards the slope of the bath, her legs straight and resting on the narrow end. Would a woman, having suffered a fit, get into this position?
Spilsbury had measured the victims and also taken measurements of the length of the bath. He stated that if Bessie Mundy had had a fit in the bath, she would have lain with her back against the sloping end. There was no position in which she could have come immersed. Their legs would have been pulled upwards and so forcing their head down through the water, causing inhalation, spasm of the larynx, and sudden death, a form of drowning.
Spilsbury's hypothesis impressed the jury, for they had been taken out of court to witness an experiment that ended in a startling and convincing manner. A nurse stepped into the bath. With a swift and sudden movement, the inspector grasped her feet, and her head was forced under the water. She immediately showed signs of distress, and when hastily pulled out, had to be revived.
Much was made of Smith's sex appeal. There were rather unladylike scenes in court where women in big picture hats were pressed forward to get a look at Smith, and in some cases even trying to touch him.
The public was so captivated by the brides in the bath tragedy that it soon became part of popular mythology. The American writer Ogden Nash neatly summed up the case. Consider, friends, George Joseph Smith, a Briton not to trifle with. When wives aroused his greed or wrath, he led them firmly to the bath. Instead of guzzling in the pub, he drowned his troubles in the tub. During the judge's summing up, Smith repeatedly interrupted, shouting, "You may as well hang me at once the way you're going on. I'm not a murderer, though I may be a bit peculiar." But there was an inevitability about the jury's verdict. Guilty. All of Smith's bravado vanished, and he gripped the rail in front of him, sweating profusely. In Pentonville Prison, London, on the 13th of August 1915, he was dragged from his cell to the scaffold in a state of near collapse. His last words were, "I am innocent."
The lasting irony of the case, I think, is that at a point in history when the flower of English manhood is being mown down in its millions in the trenches in Europe, British justice in all its robed majesty was figuring out the fate of one transparently contemptible bastard, the blustering bounder from Bethnal Green.
Our next case also concerns the death of a young wife, at home and in her bath. Here, drowning was used as a smokescreen to mask the true and most unusual cause of death. Exemplary forensic work, however, resulted in a charge of murder. On the 3rd of May 1957, a doctor was called to a house in Bradford, Yorkshire. A distraught husband, charge nurse Kenneth Barlow, was waiting for him. His wife, 31-year-old Elizabeth, was lying dead in the bath. Barlow told the doctor that he had discovered his wife after waking from a doze. He realized that she'd been a long time in the bathroom and had gone downstairs to see if she was all right. He told the doctor that when he found her, she had been submerged in the water. He had tried to lift her out of the bath, but that failing, he had pulled out the plug and then tried artificial respiration. The doctor examined the dead woman. There were no signs of violent injury, but one thing puzzled him. Her pupils were very dilated. The doctor thought this worthy of further examination, and so called the police. When the police arrived, they immediately noted several things. Barlow's pyjamas were completely dry, odd as he said that he had tried to get his wife out of the bath. There was no water on the floor in the bathroom, and Elizabeth Barlow looked undisturbed, which would have been unlikely if artificial respiration had been tried. George Carrington was a sergeant in the CID at the time.
When I arrived at the house in Thornbury, there was John Naylor there, Sergeant John Naylor, and a doctor, and John did just say to me, "Go next door, see what you think." We met him before. So I went next door, and in the house there was Kenneth Barlow. I'd met him previously due to his first wife being found dead under suspicious circumstances.
In May 1956, I went along to an inquest on the first Mrs. Barlow. It transpired that she died from natural causes. That was the verdict of the coroner. Mr. Barlow seemed perfectly genuine. It gave the impression of being distressed, and everybody sort of felt for him at the time. You know, not something you'd wish on anyone.
But when, only 11 months later, the second Mrs. Barlow was found dead, it seemed too much of a coincidence.
I think the important thing which started a really thorough investigation was this, quite simply, that to lose a young wife in her 30s once is awful. To lose a second one within a year is almost incredible.
Police searched the house. They removed several items, including vomit-stained cloths and sheets, and Mrs. Barlow's flowered pyjamas. These were very damp and smelt of perspiration. In the kitchen, police found a ceramic pot. Inside were syringes and needles. The larger of the two syringes was 3/4 withdrawn and wet inside. But the significance of the needles was not immediately apparent.
The post-mortem examination of Elizabeth Barlow didn't give any easy answers. The pathologist, he looked for needle marks but couldn't find any. And when the blood and tissue samples were analysed, no poisons or drugs were found. She was quite healthy, and in fact it showed she was about 2 months pregnant.
A neighbour, a lady, said, I was coming to have a talk this afternoon with Mrs. Barlow, and as I was passing the window, the kitchen window, I saw Kenneth Barlow injecting his wife's buttock with a syringe.
So 5 days after her death, the pathologist decided to take a closer look.
Dr. David Price examined the body from top to toe under a magnifying glass and then identified these marks on the buttocks.
When confronted with the evidence of the needle marks on Elizabeth Barlow's body, however, Barlow made a new statement. He admitted that he had been injecting his wife. He said that his wife had willingly had the injections in the hope that they would bring on a miscarriage. He stated that neither of them wanted the child she was expecting. Dr. Price suspected that what might really have been injected into Elizabeth Barlow was insulin. Kenneth Barlow had described his wife's symptoms with the accuracy of a trained nurse. She had felt ill all evening and had been sick. She had complained of feeling hot and had sweated profusely as her damp pyjamas showed. And there was the fact that her pupils had been dilated. It all supported Dr. Price's theory that she had been injected with insulin.
Insulin's a naturally occurring hormone in the body, and its role is to control the level of sugar in the blood by allowing the cells to utilize that sugar, but also promoting storage of the sugar in the liver. If the body has too little insulin, then the individual develops a disease known as diabetes. Diabetes is often treated by injections of insulin, and the aim of these injections is to keep the blood sugar in the bloodstream at just the right level. If too much insulin is given and the blood sugar falls too low, then the person will become confused, lose consciousness, and may even die.
Dr. Price arrived at the conclusion that the death of Mrs. Barlow had been caused by drowning while she was under what is called a hypoglycemic coma as a result of the injection of insulin into her buttocks. But the scientists were faced with a problem with this theory. If she had been given a large dose of insulin, then it was likely that her blood sugar level would fall dramatically. But when Elizabeth Barlow's heart had been examined, the result was quite the opposite. The blood sugar level had been very high. The group of scientists on the case who had been gathered from around the country were undeterred. They felt, as did the police, that insulin was the key to Elizabeth Barlow's death. As a nurse, Kenneth Barlow had easy access to the drug, and a colleague of Barlow's had told police that Barlow had spoken of insulin being ideal for a perfect murder because it dissolved in the blood and could not be traced. Eventually, after exhaustive testing, the problem of the high blood sugar level found in Mrs. Barlow was tackled. Mice were injected with insulin and their reaction studied. They became comatose and died. Then mice were injected with extract of tissue taken from Mrs. Barlow's buttocks. These mice reacted in exactly the same way.
Violent struggling causes a rise of lactic acid in the muscles and sometimes in the bloodstream. And new research has shown that acidic conditions preserve insulin. And this is why, when Elizabeth Barlow's muscles were analysed, the insulin could be detected.
Barlow was finally arrested in July 1957, 4 months after his wife's death. It was the first case of murder by insulin to reach the British courts. His defence stated that it appeared to be quite clear that Barlow was an accomplice to an attempted abortion, but denied that he had ever intended to murder his wife. But the prosecution suggested that after attempts at abortion had failed, Barlow had decided that the only way to kill the baby was to kill his wife as well. He continued the injections, but switched the contents from ergometrin, a drug which contracts the muscles, to insulin. But the defense put forward another theory. They alleged that Elizabeth Barlow had slipped under the water and that in that moment of fear, her pancreas had released a massive dose of insulin into her bloodstream, causing coma and almost instant death. But the prosecution countered that though insulin rapidly disappears from the body, 84 units had been found in Elizabeth Barlow's remains, and that to account for this, her pancreas would have had to secrete an impossible 15,000 units.
The jury had only been out for a short period, less than 2 hours, and they found him guilty. So they was convinced that the evidence given was good. Barlow was very cool and didn't seem to be upset by the verdict.
Mr. Barlow himself always denied killing his wife. And because Mr. Barlow always denied murder, we shall never know.
Compared with the complexities of the Barlow case, the murders of George Joseph Smith some 40-odd years earlier seem, well, crude and repetitive. Both cases, however, illustrate that when one has a mind to murder, there is usually a method close to hand.
Discovery Next is on the murder trail. We return to New York in 1977 when a killer went after courting couples. At least 6 women were killed by Son of Sam. Do stay with us.